it's almost as if our identity changes after grief, especially after suicide loss. There's just this kind of sense of, who am I now? Like I said, who am I if my brother couldn't be here anymore? Who am I? And then you have to start piecing that back together again. And I think my research, my own therapy, has been a part of that, rebuilding my identity, rebuilding my belief system.
Hello, and welcome to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. This podcast is about exploring the grief that occurs at different times in our lives, in which we have had major changes and transitions that literally shake us to the core and make us experience grief. I created this podcast for people to feel a little less hopeless and alone in their own grief process as they hear the stories of others who have had similar journeys. I'm Kendra Rinaldi, your host. Now, let's dive right into today's episode. We have with us today, we have Sue Egan, all the way from the UK. I'll find out what part of the UK in just a minute when you share your story. Sue is also a podcast host, recently launched a podcast called The Healing Narratives of Suicide. And she is a suicide grief psychotherapist and is now working towards her doctorate in psychology. I'm excited to have you on the podcast, Sue. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much.
Hi.
Yeah, it's great to be here amongst fellow grief podcasters.
And about amongst fellow grievers too. It's like not only are you a podcaster, but you're also a griever as I am as well. And so we can relate to people's stories in some way. Not understand, but relate, right? Do you find that?
Totally. There's a real sense of union, I think, solidarity whenever I meet anybody who's been on a similar journey. It's such a complicated one, and often you feel so alone in it and so isolated, and just to have the understanding that someone else has been in those shoes and is still standing. That's what it's all about for me, and that's where I am with my journey now, trying to help other people understand that.
Oh wow, yeah, you're right.
It's a real
it makes you makes you feel less alone.
Yes, exactly. It feels a privilege. It feels part of my healing to do my podcast and to keep speaking to people, because if I lock it away, which I did initially, I locked it away, and it felt, just to survive, just to get through every single day with being a mum and doing my studies, I had to just not pretend it didn't happen, but just get my head down and carry on. And I think now that I talk to other people, I've done my research, it's not been easy, and I've had headaches and migraines. I've had the experience of going back to the event, talking through it, and I come out the other side of those headaches a little bit more relieved. Of course, it never disappears, but each time I do that, at the end of the process, I feel a little bit lighter and more at peace. Isn't the right word either. I find it really difficult to find the words because it's such a huge thing to happen. So there's a sense of peace there, more peace than I've ever had each time I do it. That's all the only way I can describe it. It gets lighter and lighter each time, and it's never going to disappear. But every time I speak to somebody, I learn. I'm so humbled by it, by hearing their stories.
Yeah, you learned something from somebody else, and you're like, oh wow, yeah, I guess I'm not the only one that gets headaches from this process, or I'm not the only one that feels certain ways in my grief journey. Others have assimilated their grief in the same way. So let's kind of rewind, since we haven't heard a little bit more about you. So where in the UK do you live? And you mentioned you're a mom. So let's talk about that, and then we'll talk about your brother, and then where you are now.
Great, yeah. I've got 4 children. I've got 4 teenagers now. I'm a single mum. Been a single mum now for 6 years, and I think that in itself is a job in itself, absolutely, 100%. And keeping them emotionally happy as teenagers today, I find one of the biggest challenges in the society we live in, you know, with social media and things, keeping them emotionally well, especially with lockdown and all the things we've been going through. So yeah, that's I feel that's me really as a mum. And I think often we say, what more do I need to be? But sometimes just to say I'm a mum is really important. And that's my main
Mm.
kind of thing, especially as a single mum, I've been sort of concentrating on for a really long time. And as they're getting older
That's
now,
your
my daughter's
role. Your
19.
role
I
right
had
now
4 children
is,
in 5 years. So yeah,
so it's 14, 15, 6. Oh, so
yeah,
tell us, so
I,
19 is
I,
your oldest?
yeah, 19, 17. They keep changing age, so I have to remember. 19, 17, 15, and then 14. I have to work it out. Is it like, is he
Oh,
16 yet or not? Is he just had
you
his,
did
oh, he's just
it.
had his 16th birthday. They go 19, 17, 16, 14. Got it. Yeah, yeah.
Love it.
I
So,
had 4 in 5 years. So
so then
life
you
has never been quiet.
oh, wow. So this was 6 years ago that you became a single mom. So was that in your, was it a divorce, due to divorce, separation, when you became a single mom?
Yes, yeah, no, yeah, separation. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Still married, but
How,
separated.
how
Yeah,
was even
yeah.
separated? So even in that aspect of even just that, and we'll talk, of course, about the death of your brother, but in that aspect of the end of that relationship, did you experience grief in that moment as well, 6 years ago?
Oh gosh, I think when you marry somebody and you believe it's going to be forever, there's certainly a grief sense of your belief system kind of saying, but I've got to let go of that thing I believed. I've got to let go of that belief I had that this would be forever. And you know, when you invest in a relationship for so long and you try 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 for years and years and years, there's a real letting go at that stage. I've lost my mum as well. My mum died just before I separated, actually. And I think my mum dying helped me to finally kind of put myself first and say, do I really want to be here? So actually, that was kind of mixed up with my mum's grief quite a lot. And what I learned from her death was
Mm.
huge, massive, what I learned from my mum's death. And she died from a natural causes, Pick's disease. And I nursed her, you know.
I had never heard of that. Pick's, you said? Pick's disease?
Yeah, Pick's disease. It's not very well known. It's not known until they've passed away, unfortunately, because it's not very easy to be picked up. So it's like an early onset dementia. Basically, it presents as that.
Okay.
So she started showing signs of dementia at 58, 59 years old, which is very early. And she was given loads of different diagnoses in terms of frontotemporal dementia, Alzheimer's. She got every disease that diagnosis under the sun to try and work out what was wrong. And it wasn't until she passed away that they went, now we know it's PICS because of the way she died. It's like, okay, but
Mm.
it's a fatal disease. You know, there's nothing anybody could have done, which is very different to
How
suicide, a
long did
suicide
you care
loss.
for her?
And obviously that's all implicated as well, probably. Oh, a
Oh,
year.
wait,
I
wait,
came back
wait.
home a year
But
before she
your
died to,
brother,
um,
oh, to take care of her. I'm sorry. And by chance, sorry, there's delay a little bit in our sound. I think partly our connection. I was just telling Sue before we started recording here that there's a big storm here in Texas as we're recording, and she has an incoming storm there in the UK. So it's like we're both kind of in the middle of that. So if I interrupt you, Sue, or if I'm like waiting to like then talk to you, is because there's a little bit of a delay. So my apologies. And it may not show once I edit, but it's showing now as I'm like pausing to kind of
yeah,
talk to you. So my apologies there
yeah.
with
No, I
the
understand.
delay.
No, I
So
understand.
you were saying then but your brother passed away was after your mom passing. So correct?
Yeah, yeah. I should probably be clearer with that. Yeah, 6 years ago, my mum passed away, and I separated about a month after that, 2 months maybe after that, and then my brother passed 2 years after that, which was 4 years ago. So in the last 6 years, I've gone from a family of six, you know, my mum, my dad, four siblings, me and my three siblings, 4 children, I should
Mhm.
say, me and three siblings. We we've gone from six to four in 6 years, which is crazy because I'm only 44 years old. I'm not that old to lose. two people that
Oh
quickly.
no.
And I think as I'm the youngest of all that, so for me to look up and see that the family go from four to six, we've always been a big family of six. So to suddenly go to four within that space of time, it just, you learn so much from it about life, death, what's important, what's not. And it's made me who I am today for sure.
Absolutely. Now let's talk then. So your mom died of Pick's disease, and then your brother, 2 years later, then with the circumstances around his death, he died by suicide. Correct?
Correct. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Um, Absolute shock. He was an awesome man. You know, he was everybody's knight in shining armor. You know, he would do anything for anybody. He would. He gave me his car because I didn't have one. You know, just out of the generosity of his heart. He worked hard. He had businesses. He had a family. He had children, and you know, he had the. If anyone's looks at my Instagram page, you know, there's a picture of him there with his muscles because on the face of it,
Mm.
he came fifth in a bodybuilder competition, you know, 6 months before. So he looked amazing, and everyone thought a successful businessman, and that's what you saw on the cover of Andrew.
Mm.
But underneath that, who knows? You know, so the shock for me was just immense the day I found out, and
Mm.
immense in terms of picking up the pieces afterwards to work out what just happened there, because there was no pre-warning like there was with my mum. You know, I had the pre-warning, the anticipatory grief with my mum, where I said goodbye. You know, I was able to
But you
come
know.
to terms with her death
Mm.
before she left. So there was, yeah,
So with your brother, there was no signs of depression or anything like that that neither you or his family, his his kids and companion like had noticed at all.
I mean, we were very close, me and my brother, and he did say to me at the sort of earlier the year before, that he wasn't happy, that things weren't quite right. We talked a lot, and he got therapy. He went to, I know, a cranial psychotherapist, a normal therapist. He went to the doctors. He got lots of support. And when I then spoke to him, sort of every so often, he was getting better. He was improving, and so in my eyes, yeah, he was getting better. He was improving, and he was my brother. He was the he looked after me when I was young. He was My dad was quite ill when I was young, so my mum would go off to hospital to look after my dad, and my brother, the eldest brother of the family, would step up and cook us dinner and bring us home from school, do that whole thing. And I always looked up to him, my big brother, you know. And so to me, he was the strongest man in the world, and I always asked for his advice. And suddenly you can't do that anymore, and suddenly you're picking up the pieces from the idea that he was the strongest person I knew, and he was part of my belief system. He's a sibling. He's part of my attachment, which I talk a lot about in terms of psychology. I attached to him as a child. He was part of who I am as a brother. So when he had to do what he did, I do believe, from everything I've sort of come to terms with since, that he was in a place where he couldn't live anymore. And I don't know the exact reasons for that. I'm not in his head. I'll never be able to go back into his head. But I have to come to some peace with knowing that he couldn't be here anymore. And him not being here anymore for me at the time was just if he can't be here, how can I be here? Didn't make sense to me because he was such
Mm.
a big, strong guy, you know, in my eyes.
Mm. Wow, thank you for sharing that, Sue. Thank you. And I I can only imagine, and actually, I've experienced the dynamics of a family changing when somebody dies. Just mine was a little bit more spread out. My sister died of a car accident, and my mom died of cancer, but with 20 years difference there. So the dynamics, like you mentioned, of going from that family of six, which we were also six, to going to a family of four. Um, that I can relate to. So how did that shift? And you mentioned you guys didn't live in the same city as a family. Do you have some of your siblings that live in your same city, or your because you said you would go often to your mom. So your mom and your dad live a little farther from you. How is that? how are you all spread out?
Yeah. Yeah, we're all spread out in the southwest of England, and there's like an hour between all of us separately. And I actually lived on the Isle of Wight, which is a little island off the south coast of the UK, and I came back towards the southwest when I found out my mum was ill to support her and support my dad. And I'm so pleased I did that, because looking back, that gave me such a place of being able to say goodbye, and look after her, really, because she'd looked after me all her life, and it was my turn to look after her. And for me, that was so healing to be able to do that with her, spend those moments with her in that last year. I'm so pleased I moved back. So we're all, yeah, in the southwest, and my brother was kind of an hour and a half away from me, so he was probably the furthest. So we couldn't just pop down the road and have a cup of tea. No, we'd have to make the effort to go and see each other. And I think that always takes effort when your family lives an hour or so away. It always takes that extra effort. And once it's kind of too late, you always look back and think, I wish, I wish, I wish, I wish. I wish I'd maybe popped over more or whatever. But I can't put myself through that over and over again,
Mm,
because otherwise it's just
mm.
this vicious
You
thought
said,
going through your head. And as a psychologist, I understand that how
yeah,
damaging that can be to that self-talk. That self-talk is so powerful, basically.
yes, yes, it is. Now let me ask you something. Were you already practicing psychology at that moment? I know you, I mean, it's been 4 years, or did you become a psychologist? Have you been working towards your psychology degree now? Like, what was your studies before, or were you studying psychology? Just curious.
Yeah. So 15 years ago, I started my psychology degree when my children were young, and I was running a business at the time, and I just wanted to do something towards my future that I really believed in. So I didn't have any qualifications coming out of school. So I was 30 years old, nearly 30, and I said, right, I'm going to do a psychology degree. And I did it all online in 8 years with my kids young, looking after them.
Incredible.
And then I thought, what do I do with this now? I've got a psychology degree and I want to help people. So then I did a counselling degree, which took 4 years on top of all the certificates you've got to do and things to become a counsellor.
Oh, wow.
And I also did some teaching assistant jobs and things around like that around then. And then after that, I thought, I'm not done yet. I don't feel done with my studies. So I then went on to the counselling psychology doctorate, which is a 4-year course, which I'm at my final year. I've finally done my last handing of my essays this week. I'm like, oh, it's amazing. I've done all my placement. I've done 450 hours
Congratulations.
of therapy. I've done 450 hours of free therapy in the NHS to get my award. You have to do so much work, so many essays, and I'm doing my research into suicide grief, which is part of my story and my healing, most definitely. And that So yeah, my brother died 4 years ago. I started the doctorate 4 years ago, so it felt natural. I did my research on suicide grief and what it's like for those left behind, like me.
Wow. So would you say that that has been your biggest tool in your grief journey, has been studying suicide grief and talking to people that are grieving after suicide?
Absolutely. After Andrew died, I saw a post. I was counselling. I was a voluntary counsellor in a school at the time, and for a charity called Place to Be in the UK, they offer they're a charity. They're a charity that offers counselling within high schools and schools in the UK. And I was volunteering with them, counselling children at school. And they said, "Oh, anybody want to run the London Marathon for funding?" I said, "Oh, I'll do that in Andrew's name." So I'd never run an inch before in my life. Well, I probably had run an inch when I was younger, but as an adult, I hadn't run the marathon. And actually, my sister ran the marathon a couple of years before, and I saw her cross the line, and I said, "I'm never doing that. Why would you do that to your body? Why would you run 26.6 miles out of choice?" But because, but my, but but I had a reason. Something in me wanted to tell everybody, because suicide brings with it such a stigma, such a shame, such a lot of shame. I needed a way to tell everybody. And what my research is showing is a lot of us, when we lose someone to suicide, we have to go really convoluted ways to get to sharing our story, because just to nip down the road and tell somebody is really difficult. And it's difficult with any type of grief. But when you're talking about suicide, it brings in with it an extra layer that, you know, people always ask, you know, you say, so and so, my brother died, took his own life. Well, why did he take his own life? You know, you get all the questions. And I think you get that naturally, but you're holding so much responsibility for that, so much guilt, so much of your own stuff. It's really hard sometimes to explain because you don't even know yourself sometimes. So to try and explain that. So anyway, you can't nip down the road and tell anybody. So we almost have to go on this real journey of exploration. It's almost as if our identity changes after grief, especially after suicide loss. There's just this kind of sense of, who am I now? Like I said, who am I if my brother couldn't be here anymore? Who am I? And then you have to start piecing that back together again. And I think my research, my own therapy, has been a part of that, rebuilding my identity, rebuilding my belief system, basically, to sum it up.
That Yeah, no, no, no. That is so huge because now in just the period of 6 years, your identity shifted so many times, right? In that period of 6 years. So your identity as the daughter of your mom, that kind of shifted after your mom passed away. You're still her daughter, but yet she's not no longer on this earthly plane. Then your identity as a wife shifted. Then your identity as the little sister of Andrew and having this big brother. So many shifts in just the identity within that 6 year period. And even more so then, as you
Yeah.
said, to add the layer
Mhm.
of the how he died and having to then kind of how do you share that and so forth. So in this piecing together, have you been able to then piece together who you are without some of the labels that we carry sometimes in our life? Does that make sense what I'm saying? Like, who I sometimes wonder, like, if we identify ourselves more with the labels, and you being in psychology, I wonder if this is something you think of as well. If we identify more with the
Mm,
labels
mm,
of our identity, of what our identity is, than with our trueness. Like, who would I be were I not a mom? Who would I be were I not a wife? Who would I be? Like, who would I be without that title?
mm. Totally. Yeah. Yeah. And I think we're too, we as human beings, we're doers, aren't we? I do the wife thing. I do the
Mm.
mum thing. I do the sister thing. I do the daughter thing, instead
Oh,
of just
that's
making
such a
me who I am. I'm a human being.
Yes. I like how you said it. We do. It's like a role. Yeah. That what you're just saying. We're doing that. It's a period of time that we're doing that role. Um, that's a good point. Okay. Now, what have been some of the biggest then tools in this journey then in the last, I'm going to say 6 years truly, because your grief journey has started, with your mom's passing.
Yeah.
So what have been some of these tools aside from then your research and suicide grief, and what other things have you used in your grief journey?
Yeah. The marathon was the turning point for me because I could stand next to somebody who had the same kind of grief as me, and we didn't even necessarily have to speak, but we understood without words. And I think words are so, like you say, mum, daughter, they're all words, aren't they? Words,
Mm,
sometimes there aren't enough words to convey how you're feeling, and to just be present with
mhm,
somebody who understands that words don't quite convey how you're feeling, that's enough. And to be held in that space, that for me, that's been very powerful. And I keep meeting people over and over again with my podcast, and just by sharing my story, just being around people, there's just such a connection. And for me, that's huge because you can recognize then that you are that being. You're not a doing. You're a human being. You're standing here now as you are in your true essence of being that person. We're not doers. We are human beings, and to be a human being,
yes.
whether it's a psychologist, a counselor. I was a counsellor when my brother took his life. I mean, for me, there was an absolute, how can I call myself a counsellor and go on to a doctorate if I couldn't even save my brother? There's a real sense of
Oh,
that when we're professionals. that we hit, that hits our identity. But again, it's picking apart that that's not me, that's not me, that's not my identity. That's kind of what I do, and I love what I do. I absolutely love what I do. I take that is part of my identity, is part of who I am. But underneath it is a more
Yes.
complicated layer of who I am as a counselling psychologist, who I am as a counselling psychologist, which will be different to somebody else as a counselling psychologist, and then a different counselling psychologist. I'm a different mum than somebody else who's a different mum.
Absolutely. And something was bigger than your relationship with your brother and that dynamic. You were not the psychologist. You were the little daughter, you were the little sister. You were not the psychologist in that dynamic. So you know what I mean? Just like you're not a psychologist in the role that you play
Mm,
with your children. You're the mom. So that is not the
mm,
role you play in those dynamics and relationships. So therefore, there shouldn't be this added burden or responsibility in those relationships.
yeah, totally. Yeah,
Makes sense.
totally. You're
Yeah.
right. Yeah, I
So,
think.
yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Now, tell us then, how did you then navigate your grief journey as alongside helping your children navigate theirs as well? And what helped
Mm,
them in their journey?
yeah. I mean, the biggest thing was telling my children that Andrew, has suicided, and there was no avoiding it because they could see it. They could see on my. There was for me, there was no way of getting around it, and certainly now,
Mhm.
everything I'm doing with the podcast and doing my research, suicide is very much part of our discourse, and I think that helps because it's not hidden away. We still I think what's lovely, there's lovely little things you can do, isn't there? There's lovely little things that help me, like when we go out for a dinner as a family, we still leave 2 chairs for Mum and Andrew around the table, even though they're not
Oh,
there, because I do
I
believe
love.
we can still be connected on a different level. I don't know what that level is. I don't necessarily I can't give it a label. I can't see what that is, but I do feel very strongly connected to my brother and my mum. And you can honour that in those little ways, can't you? Like leaving the chairs for them, or having a quick chat with them when you feel like it and feeling that they answer back, or having the pictures where they need to be. And that's for me signs of healthy grief, in inverted commas. Healthy, I don't like using that word because I don't know if there's such a thing, but for me it feels healthy to do that.
Mhm.
And respectful, actually respectful, because if I wasn't grieving, I wouldn't have loved them. I have to grieve
Mhm.
because I have loved them. I do love them.
Yeah, that love doesn't end just because they're not physically here. So therefore, those emotions of missing them are still there, and the grief is there accompanying that. Wow. Now,
Mm.
what other learnings have you had in these? You've just recently launched your podcast. Which have been some of the biggest learnings that you've had in talking to other grievers that have lost their loved one by suicide?
Yeah, my research has been the same. I've been talking to people through my research, and I'm writing up the conclusions and recommendations now for professionals, for professional counselling psychologists and things, to understand suicide grief a bit better, because we don't understand it fully, I don't think, as professionals. And I think what I've learned from all of that and my podcast is the complexity of it, the enormity of it, of any type of grief, the the shift in your identity, the responsibility we take, the guilt we
Mhm.
have, the whys, the whats, the thoughts, the it all gets wrapped up. And what I want to see happen is suicide grief become something. This is my recommendations from my research. I would like suicide grief to become separate to suicide prevention narrative, which suicide prevention,
Mhm.
because we haven't got necessarily a discourse around suicide grief in the outside world. We always go in with suicide prevention. So if you try and get support after a suicide loss in the UK, you go through a whole alleyway of suicide prevention. So by the time you get there, for me, it feels a bit. well, I can't prevent it. I haven't prevented it. He's
It already
gone. I
happened.
just want
Mhm,
support. So I
mhm.
think we need to, yeah, we need to separate the support from suicide prevention. Of course, the suicide prevention needs to go ahead. We need to try and stop as many lives being lost to suicide as we possibly can. But our loss needs to be separated out so that we can support those people directly without them going through the whole narrative of suicide prevention on the way to getting their support. And we need to offer more for those who lose to suicide, because what I've realised, worked out, concluded is it takes more than just talking. It takes a lot of people go to running after suicide loss. A lot of people go to
Mhm.
writing a book, talking at conferences, yoga, me with my marathon, doing research. It's as if we can't do it in silence. We have to do it
Mhm.
quite out. Some of us have to do it quite outwardly, and we have to find ways of doing it. And that's how we process our grief. So we need to be able to offer that to people, offer them tools to be able to do that, safe tools to be able to
Yes.
do that.
As you were talking about the suicide prevention and then with already the suicide grief, I was thinking, gosh, it must be very hard then for somebody, like you said, if that's the way that they get to get their help after their loved one has passed away, to go through the line of like finding out where their suicide prevention center is or whatever in their city. And having to hear all the
Mm,
ways that
mm,
something could have been stopped. It's like it makes, I'm assuming it adds this other
mm,
layer of already, like you mentioned, this responsibility that already the grievers already hold, that it's not really theirs, but it's there. You can't deny the emotions, right? The emotions are there, whether somebody wants to validate them or not. They're valid because that's what somebody's feeling. And then to
mm,
then um
mm,
having to, like, I don't know, I'm just thinking that I had never thought of it like you just pointed out, of how hard that is. So what an amazing um feat you're doing of creating this whole other, or wanting, to create this whole other arena of straight up just suicide grief support. um that is just so
mm. Yeah,
wise, and it came from a need.
really passionate about, yeah. I mean, the NHS website, I love the NHS, don't get me wrong, it does a wonderful thing for our country in so many ways. But the headline when you go for support says zero suicide, and that's their mission. So that's the first thing that hits me when I go for support through the NHS, zero suicide. And I go, okay, it, it's happened to me. And it actually feels like it happens. I've spoken to a lot of people about this. It isn't just me that feels this, but it's a sense of, I didn't decide, I didn't have to end my life, but it feels like I'm living with the life sentence. It feels like I'm living with the after effects of it, because we take so much of the responsibility. We take responsibility for telling their story because they're not here to tell it. We take responsibility for other people because we know that as soon as we say suicide, the mood will drop in the room. We take responsibility for
Mm,
the world, because the world needs to hear these things, and that's why we go on these campaigns and do what we do. So we take responsibility for everything, and that's such a heavy burden to do alone. And that's why support for me is absolutely crucial, to feel that with other people, so you're not holding that huge responsibility alone.
mm.
And a lot of that responsibility is quadrupled when you hear it was preventable. Of course, suicide is
Oh.
preventable in many instances, but sometimes it's not. And we need to recognize there's a whole suicide it's got a whole continuum behind it. It's not just one event. There's always a lead up to it, whether it takes hours, minutes, days, seconds. There's always a lead up to it. And if we understand that a bit more, and understand, because I listened to a documentary recently and it said suicide is always preventable. And I was like, no, it's not, because we're here
Mhm, mm-mm,
and it's happened to us.
mhm,
It's really happened to us. Yeah.
mhm. No, and it and it,
Starting to
it
go off on a
just
bit of a rant
leaves
there. I get a
then
bit
for.
passionate about it.
No, please do, because as you're saying it, it's like it's taking away that stigma also of just leaving then okay, not only then do the grievers have to already have to deal with the grief of their loved one being gone, but then aside from that, have to then feel this like guilt that the society is putting that they could have prevented it. Like that is just so much weight to carry. That is not
Mm.
fair. That is not fair to the grieving family. So
And it's so
absolutely, you
different,
should be passionate.
so different.
I should be passionate. Ugh.
It's so different to my mother's death. I know every grief is different and every grief is complicated. But for me, my mother's death was explainable. It was a disease that took her. And as sad as that was, and as horrible, she was way too young to die, way too young to die. As horrible as that is, it's very different to my brother made that decision, whatever word you want to use. I use that word really carefully because, again, decision isn't helpful necessarily, just like choice isn't helpful. When we say someone chose to kill themselves, it's like saying they chose to have a cup of tea or a coffee. It's not that simple. They didn't just choose that day to kill themselves. There was a whole trajectory towards that day that they went on. And there's lots of stories of suicide attempt survivors explaining the relief they felt when they made that decision because they're in so much pain. Suicide is taking away the pain they're in. It's the only solution left sometimes.
Mm-hmm. You know, I volunteer in a grief support organization, and somebody when I was doing the training, somebody that had been a participant in that grief support organization was saying how their child, who was a teen, died of suicide, and what she was saying as a mom was like, we all make decisions every day of our lives. Every day we make decisions. Sometimes our decisions are poor ones, and that what she felt was that now, her son was being remembered by the last decision that he made,
Yeah,
and that was
yeah,
not
yeah.
that was not okay. Like there were other decisions that he
Mm-hmm.
made in his life that were good ones. This last one was just the
Mm.
last one, I mean, and like you said, and it could have been that was like you were mentioning with
Yeah.
Andrew, that was the only decision he could make at that moment, for himself. And that was the right decision for him in what you're seeing, at least in his story. Because
Mm-hmm.
that was his journey or whatever it was. Um, but yeah, that is
Yeah,
definitely very
there's a lot of
different than anybody else. Hmm.
there's a lot of stories of people who felt their loved one became the suicide victim rather than the person they were. They were. The Andrew that he was.
Hmm.
That's who I remember. I don't remember his final act, and I don't
Yes.
remember him as the suicide victim. Apart from when I'm talking like this and I'm explaining it was part of his story, but it was only one part of his story, and we're left carrying that weight of the one in the family being the suicide victim. And unfortunately, that
Yes.
leads to a lot of family dynamics and a lot of problems within families because it's such a hard thing to come to terms with in your family because you're not expecting it. You're not expecting it in a million years in your family. Many people, even if you've had suicide attempts before, I've spoke to people who've had partners and things that have attempted suicide before, but actually, when it actually happens, it's such a huge shock because it's kind of one of those things. Death's a taboo subject. It's a taboo. We don't want to talk about
Oh, it
death, do
is.
we?
Yeah. Yeah.
Humans, we don't want to admit we're going to
Yeah.
die. Well,
Hmm.
suicide's
We
really
think we're
taboo subject.
invincible.
I didn't think it was going to happen in my family, not for a million years. I didn't think suicide was going to happen in my family. My family, it wouldn't happen to my family. So when it does, you're like, whoa, hang on a minute, what does this say about my family? And we take on a lot of that responsibility then again of our family is the one who's had suicide in it. What does that say about our family? It sucks, really.
Yeah, no, I can guarantee there's suicide in my family. There's suicide in mine. My uncle took his life by suicide.
Um,
So I think that once we take away the taboo, one of talking about death, like you said, death is a taboo. Then grief is a taboo, and then on top of that, then suicide's a taboo. If we start taking away those taboos and start talking more openly about it, we will find out that a lot of people are grieving. A lot of people have family, members that have died by suicide, things like that. But because we've taken away the you know what I mean? But it won't happen until we
Hmm.
have more conversations about it. So yes. Now let's talk about
100%. Yeah.
the Andrew you remember, and the relationship and some of the memories you have of him as you were growing up. You said he was so out of the four siblings, you're the youngest, he was the oldest of the four of you?
Yeah, yeah. I was Babby Sis. He was the only person who ever called me Babby Sis. Nobody will ever call me that again. I was the Babby Sis. Yeah, he was awesome. He was,
Oh,
um, yeah, just. I remember him carrying me in from the car when I was little. You know what I mean? When I pretended to be asleep, he would be the one to carry me in. He's, and he was
I
always a
love it. I
go-getter.
love it when
He
you would
went off
pretend
to
to be
France
asleep.
to. Yeah, yeah. You know what you do when you're a kid. You know, you're like, oh, if I pretend to be asleep, somebody will carry me in. Oh, it's him.
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We all
And my family
pretended.
were busy,
I
you know.
remember
My
so
family were
often
busy.
pretending to be asleep.
Oh, good. It's not just me.
Nope, not just you.
Yeah, he went away to France when he was about 13 or 14, a really young age. He went off and did, a trip to France for 6 months, stayed with the family. He was always the go-getter. He was the started his own business really young, DJing at the local, like the little clubs we had back then in the 90s, in the 80s, 90s. Um, he he was always it was always the next idea, always the next idea. He was actually a medium as well, a spiritual medium, so he would lead groups on talking with the dead. So he was a very diverse man. Really, he had businesses. He owned a business where he sold his understanding about nutrition. He was doing a nutrition degree because he believed that my mum's Pick's disease came from nutrition. So he went on a big thing after my mum died of learning about nutrition and learning about what might have killed her, what the Pick's disease, where that might have came from. And he then opened a cafe where he sold the best coffee in the world, kind of thing, because that's what Andrew did. He always did the best of everything, and had a place upstairs where he could advise people on what to eat to build muscles, basically.
Mm. So he was a giver. He was a giver. He liked helping people. He liked giving solutions to others.
Oh my gosh, yes, yes. And that's why he would be the one I'd go to if I wanted advice. He would knew everything. Just the little things. I'm just going to go for a run. What shall I eat? And that's what I miss most about him. Initially, I stopped having that person I could just ask who knew everything. So who do I ask now? Oh, I ask Google now. Sadly, and that's what I miss most, I think,
It
and just
used to
his
be Andrew.
his understanding with me about.
It used to be Andrew, and now it's Google.
Yeah, bless his heart. Just a really good guy, yeah. And the funeral was awesome. Everyone, it was just packed. The church was, with just recognition of that in him, the big heart he had. He did the mediumship for free. He'd just go and do groups, and I think he was massively affected by my mum's passing. I know he was because he was the golden boy. He was, and I don't think he could make quite sense of that, let alone anything else that was going on. And there's lots of other parts of Andrew's story, but I don't know all the answers. I don't know if they're all right or not because I've made a lot of them. I've just tried and found from all the evidence I've got, but I don't know if they're true or not.
Some of his stories, you mean?
Yeah, some of his stories of why he had to do what he did. I think I a lot of us when we lose to suicide go on a meaning making. I think with grief we always go on meaning making, but with suicide we really trying to go through their last steps. What did they do just before? Where were they the day before? What were they listening to in their car? What did they, what conversations did they have 2 days before? What led up to that moment when they decided they couldn't be here anymore? And there's a lot of meaning making for me in that with my brother trying to work out where he got to because it was such a shock. And again, you find evidence for some of what that might be, but you don't know it's absolutely 100% true because he's not here to ask. So again, it's not a story you can completely tell, but you just pieced it together the best way you can in your own head.
Mm. Now, what are some of the ways that you honor him now? You mentioned keeping a seat at the table for him and your mom. What are some of the other ways that you honor him, or um, that you remember, or that you maybe items of his that you kept? I remember when I talked to Lindsay, who you've already Lindsay Meaden,
Mm.
who you've met as well through this journey. She was mentioning about the remembrance bears that I had never heard. And she said it's very common in the UK that they make these little remembrance bears or something like that. Is that what they're called? Remembrance bear, the ones with the t-shirts and things like that.
Yeah,
There
I've
was
never
there
heard of it
any
until
other
Lindsay.
any way that you as a family? Yeah, wasn't that so sweet? That was like so cute. Perfect for her, her kids to have something to remember their uncle by. But what ways have you found to stay close to him? And especially, I'm so curious with him having been a
Mm.
medium. You mentioned you talking. Do you talk to him as well? You
Mm.
write to him. Do you say you talk to him as well?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, he gave me his car before he passed away. So I kept his car until it literally died, and it was on my drive for probably I'd say about 2 years, dead, not usable, but I could not get rid of it. I could not sell it, give it away, take it to scrap because it was him. It was him all over because he gave it to me, and it was his car. I could feel him in it, his energy in it. So that was weird. The day I let that go, it was very odd because a jacket. I've got about 10 of his t-shirts that I still wear. I still wear them now
Love it.
as my everyday t-shirts, under jumpers and things. And they've got certain muscle man things on them, from his weightlifting days, and I just give a little smile when I just see those and think, yeah, you know, and I find those really comforting. And I do talk to him, and I talk to mum. I just talk to them. I just literally talk to them as if they're here, and I'll get a knowing back of what they're saying back because I knew them so well. Now, whether that's my imagination or whether that's real, I don't know. I don't care because it helps me.
You are absolutely right. That's exactly what I say to people. It doesn't matter whether others think that those are the messages or the knowing that they're kind of communicating. It doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. As long as it brings comfort to the person that's grieving, that's all that matters. I'm the same way. I'm like, it brings me comfort to think
Yeah,
that this was a message.
yeah.
I'll hold on to that.
Yeah, and it's a way of keeping them alive, isn't it? It's a way of still having a relationship with them. They call it continuing bonds, don't they, in psychology? I don't know if you've heard about that.
Yes.
We have to continue our bonds because we were bonded to them when they were alive. We continue our bonds even though they're physically not present. We can continue those bonds through whether it's talking and hearing back what you think they'd say, or you sense you hear them, or you see the signs. I mean, my mum, the week she passed, there was butterflies everywhere, and I said to her, she died really over a 7 day period, and during that period when she was very very ill, I said to her, "Oh, mum, when you're gone, send me some butterflies." And she couldn't speak at this stage; she was completely mute for the last 6 months of her life. So she I don't know if she heard me, I don't know, but every time we get the strangest butterflies in the strangest times of years, and they hibernate. They come out in December, which is it's cold, and they sit on my dad's windowsill, and I say to dad, "That's mum. I'm sorry, that's mum. You wouldn't have a butterfly sit on your windowsill for a whole month." Oh, and the day after she died, oh my gosh, I went to a graduation for my. I trained as a Steiner teacher trainer as well, a teacher, sorry. And I went to my graduation, and I was in the hall, and a peacock butterfly flew in above my dad's head while he watched me in graduation. This is the day after she died, and a peacock butterfly was just flying around. And I'm sorry, don't care what anyone says. That was my mum saying, "I'm here at your graduation, not in a physical sense, above my dad." And it was a peacock butterfly. We don't have peacock butterflies here. They're huge. I just couldn't believe it.
I have
So
to
there
look
you
them
go. There
up.
you go.
I'm gonna have to look at. I haven't heard of a peacock butter. I'm gonna look it up right now as I'm talking to you. I'm gonna look it on my phone. I want to see what a peacock butter. I'm assuming it has a lot of the blues and the greens. Let
Oh,
me
they're
see. Peacock
beautiful.
butterfly. They're beautiful. I can see butterfly.
Oh,
I'm
it's
like looking
beautiful.
here
And they're
as you're
huge. They're
talking.
massive. You
It
can't
is, it
imagine how
is.
big they are.
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh, the colors. So beautiful. I'm looking here at the colors.
Mm.
Yeah, that is so comforting, like you said. It now what is a way in which you feel Andrew, that you feel Andrew? Like so and your mom butterflies has been something. What's a symbol or something that you see that you can relate to with Andrew?
Oh gosh,
Is there anything
I feel like
specific?
it's everything. I feel like it's everything with Andrew. It feels like I was so connected to Andrew that he's such a part of who I am. And so is my mum, of
Mm,
course, but I just sense a real deep, deep level of connection that it just takes that um, conversation for me, and I hear back what you would have said, and that's my. And I don't actually ask for anything else because for me that's so deep and so enough for what I need.
mm. I think
I learned
that
so
you're
much
right
from
that
both of
you're
their
sort of
deaths. I've learned so much.
what has been something that you've learned the most of about?
Oh, so I got a butterfly tattoo just after my mum, well, about 2 years after my mum died, because I learned from my mum just to be your absolute true self. Because I watched her take her last breath. I kissed her on her cheek when she took her last breath. And when you've got your breath coming in and out of you every single day, every single moment, now, right now, you can never take that for granted. And I'm honouring that breath every time because that can only then now be the true expression of me. Because there's nothing else. Nothing else really matters other than the fact that my breath is coming in and out and in and out. So I've learned to live my life, to the best of my ability, really. And that's it, at the best of my ability. And that won't always be right, but it's the best that I've got for me with me right now. I always just think, well, that's the best I can do right now. That's the best I can do right now. As long as it's the best I can do right now with what I've got, what tools I've got, then I just feel so lucky to be alive. And Andrew, I guess I've learned, oh gosh, I've learned about money. I've learned that it doesn't matter how much money you've got, it doesn't matter because my brother was in some debt which affected his suicide. I know it did. I think it did.
Mhm.
So I've learned that money doesn't really matter because if I could rewind the clock and say to Andrew, you're worth more than money. You're worth more than anything, any money I could have. I'd give anything to still have him here. So I've learned that from my brother, but I've also learned that we've all got a purpose, and this is my purpose right now: is continuing this conversation, Andrew's conversation, really. That we need to keep talking about it. We need to keep sharing our experiences, like you're doing on the podcast, to enable us to just keep taking those breaths moment by moment, being the best we can be with what we've got right now. And that's what I've got right now. I've got all my losses in my life, and that makes me who I am. And I can't ignore them. I don't want to ignore them.
Mhm.
And I'm going to do
Because
with
by
them whatever
ignoring
I
those,
can in my lifetime while I'm still breathing.
yeah. Yes, because by ignoring those losses, it's as if we would have ignored the fact that we had them in our life as well. So honoring the loss, knowing that we had it, and it's part of who we, who we are now. It's shaped us into who we are now, just like them being alive and them being part of our life shaped us who we are now.
Mm,
So did their death. Um, so
totally.
it's
Yeah.
part of that journey. Sue, you are just such a beautiful soul for sharing and not only your journey, but also a little bit about Andrew's life and your mom. What was your mom's name, by the way? What's your mom's name?
Margaret, very classical English name, Margaret.
Margaret.
My daughter's 19 and she's
Margaret.
got Margaret as her middle name, so that's nice. She lives on in my daughter.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you for sharing Margaret and Andrew's story. And how can people, and I'll make sure to add this in the show notes, is there anything else you'd like to say to the listeners before we close off, and just make sure to share your information of how they can get a hold of you?
Yeah. Just want to say it'll be okay. No matter where you are in your grief journey, no matter what your type of grief, it will change. Your life will change. The journey will go on. Look after yourself in it. Put yourself first in it as often as you can. Allow yourself to grieve when you need to grieve. Allow it to rise, like I've done in my research, and fall again on the other side. It's not be afraid to grieve, because grief, someone said to me recently, grief is just the expression of love we can't give to that person anymore. So if we feel upset, we feel the pain. That's our true expression of love. We can allow it to rise and fall. And I'm hoping to develop communities, lots of different layers of communities for suicide grief over the next year, to provide the kind of support people need after a suicide loss. And you can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and my website, all called suicidegriefsupport.com. Well, that's the website. Instagram is suicide, full stop, grief, full stop, support. But that'll be in the show notes.
I'll link those all below. Yeah. And your podcast.
My Healing Narratives of Suicide podcast, which I absolutely love. It's very new, it's very early, but it really is a space for anyone to share their story, losing someone to suicide. So please get in touch if you want to share your story, or if you want to listen to, it's really a space where you can find somebody who resonates with you and listen to their story. It's a place of hope, really, that we'll all get through it, because we are all still standing, and we're definitely stronger together. That's my strapline. We're stronger together.
That is true. That is true. We are stronger together. Thank you so much once again, Sue. And I look forward to listening to your podcast, as well as passing you down some of the guests that I've had that I believe will be able to share in your podcast as well, their journeys. So I'll make sure to give you some of those names as well as their grief journeys. Thank you once again.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you again so much for choosing to listen today. I hope that you can take away a few nuggets from today's episode that can bring you comfort in your times of grief. If so, it would mean so much to me if you would rate and comment on this episode. And if you feel inspired in some way to share it with someone who may need to hear this, please do so. Also, if you or someone you know has a story of grief and gratitude that should be shared so that others can be inspired as well, please reach out to me. And thanks once again for tuning in to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. Have a beautiful day.